Beseder. So, onwards with the mitzvot of kavod, ועונג, Shabbat that we're learning about. We've been learning about the mitzvot of kavod, ועונג, Shabbat since unit 27 that dealt with Tosefet Shabbat. And now we're in Shabbat itself. We accepted Shabbat, we made Kiddush. And now the other side, possibly the other side of the coin of Kiddush is Havdala. Havdala is divided into two units, unit 31 that gives the background about the mitzvah itself of Havdala, and unit 32 that goes into the details of the wine, of the besamim, and of the candle, the fire. So we are continuing our Shiur Morenu Shiurim, unit 31, for the menucha of Sir Naim Dangur and Sir Moses Montefiore. We are going into the mitzvah of Havdala. So where does this whole idea of making Havdala start from? So the Gemara in Pesachim Kuf Vav is a drasha we've learned already before. That has to do with Kiddush, right? Zachot Yom Shabbat lekadsho, zochrehu al hayayin biknisato, en li ela balayla bayom minayin temud lomar zachot Yom Shabbat. An interesting thing is that the Girsa in the Gemara here, right? What the Gemara says over here refers to Kiddush at night and during the day. I just want to skip over to the Netziv brings a different girsa. We're going to see the Rambam and Rashi seem to have that version as well. But I skipped the bottom of page one. Yes. The Netziv in the Ha'amek She'ala writes, "B'chtav yad ita en lele b'knisato b'tziato minayin." Right. So Et Yom is not nidrash on the day Kiddush; it's nidrash on Havdalah. והאחי נוסחה בספרו של רבנו לפני רית הזקן בספר המכריע, שהביא נוסחה בריש מסכת נזיר. You remember we saw the Gemara in Nazir. This has to do with this Rashi, who is not Rashi. It's the Mefarish on Nazir who took Rashi's place in Rashi's absence, in Nazir specifically, right? Who said, מושבע ועומד עליו נהר סיני, דכתיב זכור כי יום שבת לקדשו, זכרו על היין, אין לי אלא בכניסתו, ביציאתו מיניים. So we mentioned why it's important to make Kiddush at the turn of the tide, when you go from Chol to Kodesh, that's when you make Kiddush. And at the other end, when you go from Kodesh to Chol, you have to make, again, the other side of Zachor at Yom HaShabbat in order to make Shabbat exceptional. And we discussed, back when we started the mitzvah of Zachor, we discussed what does Zachor actually mean? It's not definitely not remembering per se. It's more of a commemoration, something like that. So, right, appreciation, commemoration, something between those two. Maybe my English is not good enough to have a more precise word, but I think the idea is clear. In order to properly celebrate the uniqueness of the Kedusha of Shabbat, you have to do it at both ends, both when you start and when it ends, to go into the Kedusha and to leave the Kedusha. That's the way the Girsa, the Netziv brings. The Mefarish and Nazir also has that Girsa over here, as we see. And we see the Rambam, as I opened and said, the other Havdala, according to the Rambam, is the other side of the coin of Kiddush. Let's see what he says in Perek Kaftet Halakha Aleph. Mitzvat haseh min haTorah, lekadesh et Yom HaShabbat bidvarim, meaning b'diburim, right, with speech. Shenemar zachot Yom HaShabbat lekadsho, klomar zocher zchirat shevach v'kiddush, וצריך לזכור בכניסתו וביציאתו, בכניסתו בקידוש היום וביציאתו בהבדלה. Similarly, in ספר המצוות, מצווה קנ"ה, he writes, ציוונו לקדש את השבת ולומר דברים בכניסתו וביציאתו, at both ends. נזכור בם גודל היום הזה ומעלתו והבדלו משאר הימים הקודמים ממנו והבאים אחריו. Right? In other words, I think the Rambam, the reason he writes this sentence, right, to explain why you need Kiddush as you enter. We saw the Lashon the Tur, you have to rush and make Kiddush as soon as possible. We discussed you have to make Kiddush, or maybe you could just daven as early as possible, or even say L'chadodi. Not going to that sugya again. Just saying that we see that in order to properly celebrate Shabbos uniqueness, in order to give it its proper, to address it properly, to address the Kedusha properly, it needs to be separated from the rest of the week. That's the Havdala. The word Havdala means, right, separation, right? So when it starts, you have to do something to emphasize and to express the entering that Kedusha. When it leaves at the other end, you have to do the same. we're not commemorating the rest of the week. We're saying now we're no longer in Shabbos, or as the song goes, Shabbos is going away, right? ואומרו יתעלה, זכור יום שבת לקדשו, כלומר זכרו זכר קדושה והגדלה. וזוהי מצוות קידוש. לשון נחיל את הזכור יום שבת לקדשו, קדשו בברכה, בביאור אמרו, זוכרו ליין, ואמרו גם כן, קדשו בכניסתו, קדשו ביציאתו. Right, we see a similar גרסה. כלומר, הבדלה שהיא גם כן חלק מזכירת השבת, ומתוקנת ומצווה. בסדר? So, the mitzvah of Havdala, according to the Rambam, according to the Mefarish Lechora, the Netziv brings the same comes from the Machriya, that Havdala is the other end of Kiddush. If you don't do Havdala, your Kiddush isn't good enough, I dare say, right? You go into Shabbos, you elevate the Kedusha Lavol by making Kiddush. If you don't leave that, if it just maintained, next Shabbos, you won't say Kiddush next week, right? As it were, right? Because if you don't do Havdala now, next week's Kiddush won't mean anything because you've never left, right? Now, technically, you left. Technically, you'll do melachot. And that's part of the question we're going to be asking over the rest of the unit. Later on in the unit, we're going to go back to the question of the relationship between the mitzvah of Havdalah and our ability to do melacha after Shabbos, right? In our minds, presumably, until we do Havdalah, we can't start doing melachot. According to the Rambam, Havdalah isn't there as a matir to do melacha. Havdalah is there to make it clear that I've entered the kedusha and then I've left the kedusha, right? It's not really an issue of melacha. We're going to get back to that point. Just remember, that's a question you're going to have to raise later on. But it seems, according to the Rambam, according to the Mefarish, according to the Machriya, that this is part of the mitzvah of kiddush. Does that make it d'oraita? So the Smag says, right, the Smag goes on to the next makor. We're going to see later on, we'll address the question of is Havdalah d'oraita according to this opinion. The Smag brings a different midrash. He says like this: in Shmot it says Zachor et Yom Shabbat lekadsho, sheshayim ta'avod. In Dvarim it says Shemor et Yom Shabbat lekadsho kasher tzivecha Hashem Elokecha, and then later on it says B'zacharta ki avedi et be'eret Mitzrayim v'yotzecha Hashem Elokecha misham be'et chaska v'zor netuya. So we have Zachor et Yom Shabbat lekadsho in Shmot, and we have V'zacharta in Dvarim in a different pasuk. And the Smag brings an interesting midrash. Shnei mikrot yesh, midrash of the psukim. V'dibrot rishonot zachor, v'dibrot achronot v'zacharta. Lat'ino shtei zchirot, achat bitfila, ve'achat al hakos, בין בכניסתו, בין ביציאתו. אני אומר כי שתי הזכירות, אחת בכניסתו היא זכור, ואחת ביציאתו היא וזכרתה. כשנכתב בפרשת שמור, שם במדרש שנאמר על יציאת השבת. So this is a very interesting thing. I'll tell you how I read the Smag. How does the Smag read the pasuk? This is how I understand the Smag reads these psukim. He says like this: Zachor Yom Shabbat lekadsho. So we saw that Zachor also has to do with what you do during the week in preparation for Shabbat, right? Zachor Yom Shabbat lekadsho. So Shammai Hazaken used to buy the best cuts of meat during the week as preparation for Shabbat. That's all part of the Zachor. And then lekadsho, as Shabbat begins, you appreciate, you commemorate, you do the Zachor of that kedusha, right? You enact the Zachor of that kedusha. Then during the Shabbat, you're shomer the Shabbat. As Shabbat leaves, you have to remember that during Shabbat, everyone was resting. Now you're going back into the week. Remember that Evedei Be'eretz Mitzrayim. Right? In other words, it's true that now you could put your slaves back to work. But as you do, remember, you needed a break for Shabbos. You used to be a slave yourself. Right? It sounds like that's why V'zacharta connects to exiting Shabbat. Right? It's just a very interesting midrash, because I don't think any of us would think of connecting V'zacharta to the end of Shabbat. But you see the Smag, that's what he does. So as opposed to the Rambam, who saw Havdalah as the other side, the flip side of the coin of Zachor, the Smag says it's a separate mitzvah of Shabbos, V'zacharta as a separate mitzvah. Right? So again, part of Shabbos, but a separate mitzvah. Right? Beseder. So that's what we said. Third source, very interesting source. The Gemara in Shavuot says, Amar Bichia bara b'Amar Bichonan, kol mavdil yayin b'motzei Shabbatot, havel yayin banim zcharim. Dichtiv ulahavdil, there's a vav missing here, ben hakodesh uvein hachol, So he has a midrash, he connects להבדיל בין קודש ובין החול to להבדיל בין הטמא ובין הטהור that comes right before Parashat Ki Tazria. So at the end of Parashat Shmini. So he says, if you make Havdala properly, you will, Bezrat Hashem, have many children. Yishaki Tazria, you will have children, right? Okay. Now, obviously, he doesn't mean that the Oraita, right? The Shiur of Havdala, the Oraita, is in order to give Banim Scharim. But what he does seem to indicate is Lahavdil ben HaKodesh uvein HaChol that is the source of the Chiyuv Mitzvah of Havdala. Right? I want to differentiate between two different things going on here, two levels. The one is the Darshani level of connecting Lahavdil ben HaKodesh uvein HaChol to Ishaki Tazria. So that's the Darshani level. But who told you Lahavdil ben HaKodesh uvein HaChol has anything to do with Havdala to begin with? According to the Rambam, according to the Smag, that's not the source of the mitzvah of Havdala. Again, I'm not asking whether Rabbi Yochanan is stating in a smachta or not. I'm saying the fact that he's choosing this pasuk as a source for Havdala, that seems to be something he assumes regardless. And then he says, now I can connect that to the next part, to the pasukim later on of Yishaki Tazria. Right? So the source he seemed to indicate about Havdala is Lahavdil ben HaKodesh uvein HaChol. So the Magid Mishnah says this over here, which is the Midrash the Rambam brings. Now, I don't think he means that Rabbi Yochanan meant on the Doraita level that he's referring not to the end of the Midrash, he's referring to the middle. Do you see the distinction I'm making? The distinction between, do we have to say this Darshani way of connecting Lahavdil ben HaKodesh uvein HaChol will mimele end up with having children? Saying the step before that is to say, who said Lahavdil ben HaKodesh uvein HaChol has anything to do with Havdala to begin with? Right? The Magid Mishnah says, we see that on the Doraita level, the assumption is Lahavdil ben HaKodesh uvein HaChol means you have to do an act that is Mavdil ben Kodesh uvein Chol. Now, the interesting thing about that is that the psukim there have nothing to do with Shabbos. As opposed to the Rambam, who says, what is Havdala? Havdala is, just like you have to elevate yourself into Shabbos, you also have to ascend, I guess, right, out of Shabbos, right? If you don't do that, if you don't make that ascension, so the elevation doesn't mean anything either, right? That's what the Rambam is saying. And the Smag says, well, Shabbat has a few aspects. It has Zachor, it has Shamor, it has V'zacharta, right? So V'zacharta is one of the aspects of Shabbos, right? This Midrash about Lahavdil ben HaKodesh uvein HaChol is a pasuk in Parashat Shmini, meaning it has to do with the general kedusha of Am Yisrael and the appreciation. There are foods that are kosher and foods that are not kosher. There's a way that's tahor to live and a way that's tameh to live. And part of that is appreciating within this world that Hashem created. Hashem created Kodesh and Chol, which connects to the bracha we make, right? Hamavdil ben Kodesh lechol ben ol lechoshech ben Yisrael amim, right? Why in the world would we say ol lechoshech Yisrael amim? It has nothing to do with Shabbos, right? I mean, you could explain that at least ben Yisrael amim, because Shabbos is a brit beini uvein nechem, right, between Hashem and between us. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying, if you say the point is Lahavdil ben Kodesh uvein chol, as a mitzvah, it has nothing to do with Shabbos at all. It's just a mitzvah to appreciate that moment when you're going from Kodesh to Chol, to say 5 minutes ago was Kodesh and now I'm entering Chol. As a mitzvah unto itself it's not inherently a Shabbos mitzvah. It's an Am Yisrael mitzvah. I'd say if I was writing the Rambam, I'd put it in Sefer Kedusha. I wouldn't put it in Sefer Zmanim. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's not a din in the Shabbos, the totality of Shabbos. The din in how do we appreciate that Am Yisrael has Kedusha? It's a very different question. Beseder. Later on, you might ask yourselves, okay, why are you so excited about this? So first of all, I think it's pretty exciting, but we're going to actually see halachic nafkaminot from that distinction. So we saw three sources. I'll just sum up. We saw three sources: the Rambam, and the couple of other Rishonim, right? The Mefarish, and a couple others. say that has to do with, it's the flip side of Kiddush, is Havdala, right? Because you have to ascend in the Shabbos and descend at the other end. That's the Rambam and the Mefarish. You have the Smag, who talks about V'zacharta is another mitzvah of Zachor, mitzvah of Zacharta. And you have this Midrash, the Maggid Mishnah brings of L'Havdil ben Kodesh u'ben Achol, which is unique in that it's not really connected to Shabbos, not inherently, right? Shabbos is just one of the ways in which there's a distinction between Kodesh and Chol. So it's a good time and place to do that. Here's a moment in time I can grasp and say, okay, I can see this, right? 5 minutes ago, I couldn't use my computer, now I can. So I can start learning again, right? Now, this raises the question of how seriously does everyone take these midrashim? And when I say that, what I mean is, do they mean this on a Doraita level or a Drabana level? So, an interesting Ritva, there's a story about Rav Asi, who between first and second day Yontiv used to make Havdala. And the question is, it's not a bracha levatala, because why don't you just wait for the second day Yontiv, and then hooray, you're not sure if you should make Havdala after the first night, wait till the second night, right? Says the Ritva, he asks, Mishum Sfeika, hooray, to Safek, should you make Havdala at the end of the first day Yontiv? Safek. Heichi machid nafshelo ma'avdala. V'sfek bracha shenat tzricha, sheyesh ba mishum lo tisa. Or it's Sfek Doraita, you should machmir and not make a bracha if you're not sure if you should make a bracha. V'tiretz, ki be'emtza tefila ya mavdil v'aya chotem b'rikat yom tov. So he gives 3 answers. First, all right, how can Rav Asi choose? I'm getting mixed up. How can Rav Asi choose to make Havdalah between first and second day Yontiv? The Ritva gives 3 answers. Answer number 1, you say it as part of the bracha, part of the 4th bracha, and you don't make an extra bracha. It's not a spare bracha, so it's not a bracha levatala. Second answer, sorry, it's 2 answers. I said 3. He says Yisur bracha levatala d'Rabbanani, which is interesting in itself, as opposed to Havdalah, which is deoraita ben kodesh lechol, which is astonishing. Now, I just want to ask a question. Chiyuv Havdalah mi deoraita ben kodesh lechol. So, first of all, it's deoraita. Which of the 3 sources do you think is the source the Ritva thinks is the right one? We gave 3 sources, right? The flip side of Kiddush, right? Or V'zacharta, or L'havdil ben Kodesh u'ben Achol. Which is the one the Ritva thinks is the right one? He's saying it's Doraita, so he obviously thinks there is a real makor, right? A real source in the Psukim that indicates you have to make Havdalah. Which one, Yaakov? I see you've already unmuted yourself.
The only one I am even a little bit convinced of is Zachor. So,
sorry.
The only one that I find even remotely convincing as a possible Doraita is Zachor.
Okay, but what does the Ritva think? Oh, you're saying the Ritva probably thinks like you, that the others are simply not convincing.
Like me.
What?
Yeah.
Saying since I'm right, he thinks like me. Right. Look, I was also very surprised, but honestly, it sounds to me, and I agree that this midrash, first of all, it's obvious I emphasized at length that this is very midrashic, right? Like but still, in itself, right? Why did I give that whole speech? Because I think when the Ritva writes, I think he's indicating that midrash. I mean, the pasuk that says that's why he says why does he say ben kodesh lechol? What are these words saying? Of course, I know between ben kodesh lechol. I know, of course, ben kodesh lechol. Why do you have to tell me that? I know I'm ben kodesh lechol. What else are you mavdil at Motzei Yontiv? I think he emphasizes this to tell us that he's taking Rabbi Yochanan's drasha, which I also found very surprising. But you see, the Maggid Mishnah took it seriously, and the Ritva took it seriously. So lots of Rishonim against you, Yaakov. I don't know. I'm not saying you have to be phased.
I think that I would. No, that's fine. That's fine. I'm not phased. I would say that the reason that he used those words is because to say that it's not just between Shabbat and Chol, but it's between any Kodesh and Chol.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Although that begs the question:
how do you has the Zachor Shabbat?
That's not enough, because that still begs the question: how do you know?
Right. Right. No, you could
That's the
argue
question.
that
So how do you know that it's
he
true
thinks it's part of
between any
Kiddush, and
Kodesh L'chol,
Shabbat was Mukash to Yantiv.
I mean,
Right. You could argue that, right? That Shabbat has a makor, that Shabbat is the makor of Kiddush and Havdala. Yantiv is Mukash to Shabbat. Mele, all of the aspects of Shabbat are Mukash to Yantiv. So the Ritva says you might think it's only a Shabbos thing. Havdala do right is only on Motzei Shabbos. Nope, it's also on Yantiv. Right, possible. Now don't worry, we have the Meiri on your side. The Meiri says, I don't know. What? You're sure you're not alone? Yeah.
No, you're right that the word Kodesh L'chol are
surprising. So it's a good word for Shiur Yun, you're saying. Yeah. Right. The Meiri on the other side says that brings the Miyesh Mefarshim, and later on he seems to indicate that's also what he thinks. That Havdalah is only Midivrei Sofrim. Right? So just to sum up what we've had so far, we've had the Ramban, who says Zachor, right? That Havdalah is the flip side of Kiddush. The Smag, who says Zachor v'Zachartaz. The Zachor is one Midrash, v'Zachartaz is another one. And the Magid Mishneh, and possibly also the Ritva, say that Ulavdil ben Kodesh v'Nachon, where the Ritva clearly says that it's Doraita, though, as Yaakov said, he might think when the other drashot is the correct one, and says Doraita. The Meiri clearly says, I mean, at that point he's debating, but later on he brings Yesh Mefarshim. Later on he says very clearly it's Draban.